Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Come on, wake up out there. We've got coffee, maybe, or caffeine somewhere if you need it. Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Petrilli, president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, and thank you for joining us on this hot summer day to talk about can charter schools survive polarization and populism? The notion here is pretty straightforward, which is I think we all know we are living through a time in our country that is very polarized. And it's not just been since President Trump was elected. It's certainly been growing in recent years. And it started probably, I would put the start date somewhere around 2010 with the Tea Party movement. You started to see this populist movement on the right. And now you see in reaction to the Trump administration, the resistance, you see more and more populist movements on the left. And this is not happening just here in this country. We see that it's happening all over the West, that this is a moment that we are in, that there's a lot of this populist fervor, and that has come along with a lot of polarization, right? That this is a time when there is a huge gulf on many, many issues between Republicans and Democrats, and where a lot of dynamics are pushing the parties more and more toward their bases, right? And we see this, we even see this sort of physically. The New York Times put out something again today, a map where you can see by voting precinct whether it went strongly for Trump or for Clinton. And you can just see geographically how the way we live now, there are so few places where you've got a real mixture of people on both sides of the aisle. Instead, many of us live either in places where everybody voted for Clinton or practically everybody voted for Trump. We are in a polarized place. And this is something that is going to have an impact on everything, including those of us here in education reform. And so today we're going to talk about what impact it is having on charter schools and on charter school politics, especially in the midterm elections and especially at the state level. I was joking earlier that I was hoping that when we were waiting for the event to start that we could play some 90s music. We had a little discussion about which songs should be on there, because I have to admit that I am finding myself really looking back fondly on the late 90s. Maybe it's because I'm showing my age, and that's when I was young and in my 20s and all that. But I think it's also because back then there was also a booming economy, like we have today. But unlike today, there were a lot of dynamics pushing politics towards the middle. And I don't think we understood how good we had it back then. I mean, it was a time of peace and prosperity. We had made real progress against some challenging issues. Those of us that had grown up in the 80s or before, we remember when cities were a mess. I mean, horrific stuff happening in the crack cocaine epidemic and murder rates through the roof and a real sense of, Armageddon. And finally, by the late 90s, things were turning around and we were seeing revival in cities. And there was this very beginning of people of those cities coming back and getting much safer. Many of us on the political right were excited about welfare reform, about criminal justice reform. It seemed like we had, that there were big challenges and we had attacked them and we were making progress. And of course, it was the beginning of the modern education reform movement back then in the 90s. Teach for America and KIPP and charter schools and many of the other reforms that were getting going, and they were embraced by politicians on both sides of the aisle, right? I mean, you remember the campaign, the late 90s. I remember some of us, when we were much younger then, would have these debates. Nina, I remember representing the George W. Bush in one of those that we put on for young education professionals. Was it Rotherham who was representing Al Gore? See, some things never change, right? And the thing was, in truth, the platform of George W. Bush and the platform of Al Gore were pretty similar. I mean, it was like the big debate was, what were we going to do about bad schools? Were we going to just close them down, or were we also going to give their parents vouchers? That was the debate. So anyways, things have changed. We are in a much different place today. And we also all know that 2 years ago when people started saying, oh my gosh, Donald Trump might actually win this thing, there was this question, what is this going to mean for charter schools and for school choice? To have somebody who is, again, a polarizing figure, be so closely identified with school choice and charter schools. A lot of us, after the election, we were very nervous that this was going to make things very hard for our friends on the left to embrace charter schools and school choice. So all of that to be said, here we are, summer of 2018, and we can start to look at some evidence and how this stuff is playing out on the ground in elections, and that's what we're going to do. Follow along on Twitter, please. It is #CharterPolitics. I will be peeking at my phone to see that conversation. I'm not checking my email, I promise, but do follow the conversation there. To join us, we have a fantastic panel, and I really appreciate it. I know it's not an easy time. Everybody's traveling. But let me quickly introduce them. First, we've got Charles Barone. He is the Policy Director for Democrats for Education Reform. He's at Charles Barone on Twitter. I've known Charlie for 20 years, right? And I think that was back in the late 90s when he was working for George Miller in the House of Representatives. Next up, we have Nina Reese, the President and CEO of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. She is at Nina Charters. Again, I've worked with Nina for many years. Nina, probably back then, you were at Heritage, right? And then got involved in the George W. Bush campaign, and Nina and I worked together in the Office of Innovation and Improvement, which the current administration is talking about getting rid of. We're not very happy about that, so maybe we can discuss that later. And finally, Carlos Marquez, Senior Vice President for Government Affairs at the California Charter Schools Association. He is at EIT. I'm sorry, that's an L. El Tercero, Carlos. You've got it on your page.
There are too many Carloses on Twitter. Carlos Marquez's, so I had to come up with something else.
Seriously, Carlos. All right, we'll work on that. We're going to work on that. Okay, and California as a real case study, Colorado too, that we want to dig into today. So appreciate you flying all the way across the country to be here with us. Carlos, so with that, let's dig in. So let's talk about how this is playing out on the ground in the real world. Let's talk about California first. So Carlos, I think the conventional wisdom is that charter supporters got beat pretty badly in the Democratic primary in California. The support was for Villaraigosa. A lot of money went into his campaign from Reed Hastings and some other wealthy charter supporters, and he lost by a lot to Gavin Newsom, who was supported by the teachers' unions. So, is that conventional wisdom accurate? And how bad is this for charter schools in California?
Thank you, Mike. We had the opportunity to talk briefly before I was here with you all and talked a little bit about sort of what the landscape looks like for charter schools given the setback, admittedly, that the association and that the movement in California has experienced. I was reflecting that one of the things that organized labor has done really well is they've stood up to their adversaries, and they've stood up for their friends when their friends have defended their rights to organize and their right to collective bargaining. And so if we're going to learn anything from organized labor, I think we should certainly take away a lesson that it's important to defend our champions. And it's hard sometimes to be a Democrat fighting to support charter schools in California. And there's no one who did that in a more full-throated way than Antonio Villaraigosa, in an alignment with his values as the mayor of one of the biggest cities in the country. And so when we looked at the landscape, it was really important for us, even as we recognized that we had a tall hill, to also really evaluate what the impact could potentially be on the political landscape for charter schools if we were able to demonstrate a show of force, and if we were able to galvanize organized money and organized people in a way that would suggest, wow, maybe the charter schools movement has figured out how to flex its political muscle as well on a statewide scale, and perhaps that message would be received by our friends in the legislature, our friends at the local school board and county board level, that if you stand with us and you stand with our families, we will stand with you. So
it wasn't even in your calculation of saying, okay, we want to put our money on the horse that's most likely to win the race here, but we're sending a message to all these other political leaders that if you stick your neck out for us, we will be there for you.
Yeah, I think that was absolutely a twin goal for us. Obviously, we would have liked to see Villaraigosa advance through the primary and ultimately win in November. But we also recognize that had we simply stayed out of the race, particularly given the public policy positions that had been published by then that described where the candidates stood on charter schools, we would have looked weak, and that really was an unacceptable political position for us to be in. But I will say one more thing about just where we go from here with Newsom. I think that there are clear signs just from his personal story, if you look at that alone, that you've got someone who grew up dyslexic with a single mom and then grew up to represent a city that ultimately embraced charters at one point in the 90s and 2000s under his leadership. And so there are absolutely going to be opportunities to work with him.
So Carlos, tell us some more though, how did the charter school issue play? I mean, was this a major issue in the campaign? Was this something that drove many of the Democratic primary voters to vote for Gavin Newsom? What did that look like?
I don't know that it was determinative. I don't know that it was determinative at the ballot box, and that voters were really sort of thinking about charter schools when casting their vote. I don't know that it became a wedge issue for voters, but it was certainly a wedge issue in the media. It became a wedge issue for political observers and for elected officials. The battle lines were drawn. When you look at the sort of grass tops in political class within California. And so I would say that's really where charter schools were most pronounced. But I don't think it's a coincidence that after the primary, the presumptive governor-elect Gavin Newsom and his opponent John Cox both talked about their support for charter schools when they were asked about, gosh, what do you think about this $23 million independent expenditure campaign? What do you think about charter schools? And so, the fact that they felt like they all needed to respond in favor of charter schools, I think demonstrates that we were able to centralize charter schools in a supportive way in the campaign.
Did they also say that they love Netflix at the same time? No, just kidding. Okay, get that Reed Hastings money. All right, so interesting, but it sounds like it was not something that was front and center in this campaign. It didn't necessarily hurt. It wasn't what hurt Villaraigosa. It wasn't like because he was a charter supporter, that's why he lost this race. Right. All right, fair enough. Charlie, let's talk about Colorado a little bit. DeVos has been very strong in Colorado forever. And there you had a fascinating race. You had basically two education reformers running. And then the union-backed candidate, you'd say three. All right, well, tell us about it. In the end, Jared Polis, who started a charter school, ended up winning. And so that seems like a good news story for us.
Yeah, I mean, can you hear me? It was working before. I tried to turn it off, and it's not working now. Now it's working. So yeah, it's great to be here. I'm glad you got to the issue when you asked about whether charters was a big issue in the California campaign, because just one assumption I wanted to challenge here a little bit is that education is a top issue when it comes to people voting. It's not right now. And I just think we need to have that on the table. And for those of us who care about the issue, that's something we should take seriously, because we care about it, and we know there are lots of things that need to be done, but it's not really at the top of the minds of voters right now. And we should be concerned about that. The second thing is, the 90s weren't completely unpolarized. Bill Clinton got elected in 1992. He beat an incumbent, George Bush, 41. There was a backlash not too dissimilar to the one we saw with Obama, but much less pronounced, where the Republicans took back. I'm the old guy here, so I'm going to tell you the history. That tends to be increasingly my role in these things. I let the unions do these other things. The youngins on my staff do the real work these days. in 2 years, the Republicans took over not only the Senate, which wasn't a huge surprise, but the House, which was a gigantic surprise. And they had something called the Contract America, which was a really pretty extreme right-wing agenda, you know, from my perspective at the time. And I remember coming back to D.C. the day after the election. I had worked for a senator that lost up in Pennsylvania to Rick Santorum, and it was like, for us, it was like we were in mourning. Like, we couldn't believe, like, it felt like we had just gotten beaten up. But the difference was we went through like a year or two where things were really terrible, and Gingrich did a lot of the whipping up of people the same way Trump does. There was a bombing at the Oklahoma City government federal building in Oklahoma City. That, I think woke people up a little bit. The white extremists, supremacists got a little too disinhibited the way they seem to be getting now, and it culminated in that. But, you know, within a couple of years of the Republicans taking over Congress, we passed an IDEA reauthorization in 1997 that was bipartisan. The Republicans controlled both chambers. Clinton signed it. We did, Ted Kennedy and Trent Lott got together and passed the CHIP program, health insurance for kids. So I think the difference now is people don't work together like that and try to work across party lines, and that's a challenge in a lot of places. And the other thing I would say is, and we can get to this later, Democrats aren't as bad on the charter issue as some of you might be led to believe, and Republicans aren't quite as good. And we can get to that later. So I'll answer your question on Colorado, though. It wasn't so much about charters. I mean, there was a lot of stink created by the party establishment that tried to tie the ed reform candidates to the Trump DeVos agenda. Terms like privatization were used. There was some dissatisfaction about school closures. That was an issue, but charters wasn't really brought into it. The thing that we saw in Colorado, I think, to the extent that education might have been an issue at all, is the same kind of disconnect we're seeing in California now between Dianne Feinstein and Kevin De Leon, where the party establishment clearly favored the candidate who was running against ed reform, Kerry Kennedy in Colorado. When they had the party assembly in April of this year, only Jared and her ran, Jared Polis, who won the gubernatorial nomination in June, and she beat him 2-1 in April at the party assembly, like 66 to 33. Flash forward 2 months later, and the three reform candidates combined got 75% of the vote in the primary, and the woman, Kerry Kennedy, who ran against reform, got 25%. So if you add up Jared Polis, Mike Johnston, the other woman who ran, who's not as well known, they got 75%. So it didn't work to the extent they tried to use it at all. Jared got like 44.4, so he didn't quite hit 50, but he almost beat her by 2-1. She was like at 24, I think.
So what do you think happened? I mean, why didn't it work? I mean, is it that again, in Colorado, Democratic primary voters are fine with charter schools and school reform?
So, we have DeVos has a really strong chapter there. I talk to them a lot. What they tell me is that, for one, they're not as polarized there on the charter issue. That they've worked this in a way where they've been able to make it bipartisan. They passed a charter equity bill last year where the majority of Democrats were in favor of it. One lesson I'm told from that is they did not frame it, they did not lead with the argument of fairness for charters. They led with the argument of this is the right thing to do for kids. We have kids in some schools for which the state and the district is not spending the same amount per pupil as they are for kids in other schools. Those schools happen to be charters that were being shortchanged, but that wasn't the argument that they led on. The other thing is, in a lot of places this doesn't work, but in Colorado, the charters are district authorized. So, and in places like Denver, the the charter sector is part of a wider network of schools where all kinds of innovative things are going on. There are schools that aren't technically charters that have increased autonomies. They have school-based budgeting there in a lot of their schools, in most of their schools actually, and that's worked out pretty well. So I think that's another lesson for the charter movement is, you're embedded in a larger ecosystem. And keep in mind what the original intent of charter schools was. It wasn't to create charter schools for the sake of creating charter schools. It was to help create schools that were autonomous and that had some oversight that was related to accountability. And that's really what you're trying to explain to voters. And however you can get there, if it's an innovation school or if it's a charter school or whatever it is, that's a good thing. And so I think we need to think broadly. There are a couple of things that my Colorado people say have really made a difference there.
All right, so Nina, Charlie just said that Republicans are not as good on charter schools as some people think. There was an analysis by Rick Hess and his colleagues at AEI looking at just the campaign websites of the candidates and found the surprisingly few Republican candidates talking up charter schools. So what's happening? Are you worried? Is this not resonating on the right like it used to?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think that by and large, Republicans tend to support charters because it's about school choice, and they have stayed with us over time, but we overestimate their influence and their power and their relevance in some instances. My favorite example is in Virginia. Up until recently, this was a very red state, and it has one of the worst charter school laws in the nation because of the love of local control. Only school districts can authorize charter schools, and very few of these districts have authorized charter schools over the years. So I live in Virginia, Fairfax County. There is no charter school. So, so I think the other thing that we forget sometimes is that the allegiances that the Republicans have with school boards in a lot of these states is as strong as the allegiance that Democrats have with the teachers' unions, but these types of things don't get as much attention. So at the end of the day, this is about disrupting, to some extent, the status quo. And in rural America, unfortunately, this is one of those things that hasn't really taken root as much as it should be. But for us, though, it's really important to keep Democrats as engaged as possible because the majority of the students in our schools happen to be in the districts of members of Congress who happen to be Democrats or state legislatures where members are Democrats. So to the extent you're representing the interest of these families and their kids, it is a little strange that we don't have more support from some of these establishment Democrats.
All right, fair enough. And the Dianne Feinstein, this is her primary victory. It's a big deal for you guys at the federal level,
absolutely,
right?
yes.
Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what some on the left, what the unions, let's say, have tried to do to make this case that if you support charter schools, you are part of the Trump-DeVos privatization agenda. Has that worked anywhere? And sort of what has made it work and why hasn't it worked in other places? And, are we going to see is that going to keep coming?
I think it's worked a little, in certain places. There was a Denver school board race year before last where they used that against some of the school board candidates, and it worked against a couple of them, but not the other two. In a lot of places, it's not working. It didn't work in Colorado with Jared Polis or with Mike Johnston. I have a friend, Alice Kane, who ran for a seat in Maryland, and they tried it with her, and it didn't work. She won the primary. I do think it's potentially. Potent weapon, though, for Democrats who are trying to do certain things. Connor Williams, I imagine you read his piece in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, but if you didn't read that, Connor didn't mention, though, that I would add is, I'm not sure Betsy DeVos is really a charter school fan, to be honest with you. Denver got the top rating among all schools in the country by the Brookings Institute last year on school choice. They invited Betsy DeVos to the event to, they thought, celebrate Denver and the other cities that were rated highly on school choice. She pooped on Denver. She said Denver wasn't really a real school choice environment, pretty much implying that because they didn't have private school choice, it really didn't meet her criteria. There were two programs that used to be used through the tax code to finance charter facilities and other things. They were repealed in the Republican tax bill. There was an effort, Nina, our organization, and others made to try to save those programs. We got no help from Donald Trump or from Betsy DeVos. So I wonder, really, and charters have done well on appropriations the last couple of years in Congress, if you follow that, but there's not a lot of evidence that that's the result of anything the White House did. The one education bill that the White House seems to have had some influence on was the Career and Technical Education bill that just passed, that Trump either has signed or is going to sign. That's the only one I've seen where they've had, their hand on the dial. But
we'll get
but
back to
I
that
do think
point.
I want to, again, question your premises. Trump and DeVos aren't necessarily the friends of charter schools that people are trying to make them out to be. So, you can either be the person in the room that has everybody say that and be afraid to be the one to point out that it might not be true, which I know is uncomfortable, or be the one to say, what, there are some arguments to be made that they're really not charter supporters, and you should understand that.
So, but what has worked, let's say for Alice Kane or for some of these other candidates, when they get charged with, being at the hip with Trump and DeVos, maybe unfairly? Is there something that they say that has been working to deflect that?
They make it about something bigger. I mean, everybody who's been in this business for a while, somebody like Alice has done all kinds of things, that relate to education. I think less than Trump and DeVos, what I see out there is the white suburban voters seem to think that charters are going to take money away from their schools. That argument with them, if you look at the polling, we have something coming out soon. I wish I could present it today. I could tease it a little bit. But that's a worry for white suburban parents. That they think, and this was used effectively in Boston, and I think was the most effective argument, that if you create a charter, it's going to suck money from other schools. Technically, it's true. White affluent parents are able to do the same thing by moving. They don't seem to understand that. I could tell you about where I live, but we won't do that here. But it's just like, I can't believe what people say. It's a white affluent district, and you'd think they were, scraping by with pennies, and they're doing better than anybody, and they've still got a chip on the shoulder. So I think that's a problem. And then some of the other perceptions around it, around who favors it, the argument that it's billionaires and other very rich people who have this scheme to privatize education is also one that I think is effective with some Democratic voters.
But I think that, like you mentioned earlier, it goes back to the candidate. I don't know that there's a silver bullet to inoculating against this attack, but we've seen a number of examples in California of just mere months after Donald Trump was sworn in. Our candidates were able to win decisively in a much-watched school board election in LA Unified, even after being tarred and feathered with the DeVos-Trump name. And I think it goes back to, are you a quality candidate? I mean, the good news, if you want to run for office and you do support charter schools and education reform, is that particularly if you're a Democrat, your record counts and your resume counts, and so in the case of the candidates that we were supporting in LA Unified, one of them being Nick Melvoin, who's now the vice president of the board, and this is the second largest public school system in the country. But Nick Melvoin was a deputy within the Education Department of the Obama administration under Arne Duncan. He worked for the ACLU to sue school districts for inequitable teacher placement practices. Here's a guy, and he was homegrown. One of the ads that he used was his Jewish mother, I think she was a grandmother, she was in her 80s. And, she sort of appealed to voters on the West Side, which was largely Jewish and wealthy, about why Nick Melvoin was the homegrown guy to support. And so it goes back to, are you a good candidate? And if you're a Democrat, do you have other other progressive credentials to offer. I can give you an example in my own case. I used to work for organized labor. Glad I did it, learned a lot about democratic power. Would never do it again, though, for a variety of reasons. But I grew up poor. I grew up struggling. We did not have quality schools where I lived. If you can tell your story in a way that doesn't run away from why charter schools are great, but actually defines why you're running for office, and if your story is based on equity, bring it on. You know, and that's what we tell our candidates is like, you really have to shift the paradigm for people. Don't accept their framing and their premise because it's flawed. And if you just start to poke at it a bit, particularly if you have a compelling personal story that hasn't been served by the traditional public school system, oftentimes their arguments totally fall by the wayside.
Interesting. All right. Okay, so Nina, Charlie made this argument, I think it's pretty compelling, that maybe DeVos doesn't actually like charter schools that much. Certainly she has given some speeches where she has been mostly concerned about, well, too much regulating, and she hasn't been a full-throated supporter of test-based accountability, I would say. But, you know, she represents a big chunk of the Republican Party that is more libertarian and that is more excited, perhaps, about education savings accounts and tax credit scholarships and, you know, and not as excited, in fact, in some cases now, coming out in opposition to the notion of, in the worst cases, overruling parents if the school is low performing and closing those schools. I mean, do you think, is that part of what's happening, is that there's just more and more Republicans that are kind of moving to the right of charter schools, or is that just something those of us in our little education reform bubble are worried about?
Yeah, on DeVos, very quickly, I mean, part of what's happened also is that thanks to ESSA, a lot of power has shifted back to states and localities. So at the end of the day, that the federal government only spends about 8% of the total amount of money that goes into school districts for schooling, and right now there is no Child Left Behind, and you know the power structure has really shifted down to states and localities. So absent a piece of legislation, and I would think they were not going to go back and revisit ESEA anytime soon, it is a little difficult to lead and to galvanize support around these issues at the national level. It is true, though, that Secretary DeVos is more of a school choice fan. So when you talk to her, she doesn't single out charter schools and, you know, talk about it as much as she talks about just the notion of choice and options for families. So I agree to some extent with Charlie on that. And in terms of what they've done, I mean, if you look at in the Obama administration, one of the greatest policies that helped our movement a great deal, which doesn't get that much attention, is the Race to the Top program. When Race to the Top was put in place, one of the provisions in it that states could put in place if they wanted the funding was to lift the cap on charter schools. So Massachusetts, thanks to Governor Deval Patrick, ended up lifting its cap at the time in order to receive federal funds to grow its charter schools. So it all depends on what you're trying to do. If you want to have that, you know, that kind of federal power to support charters, right now all we have is the charter school program, which has been around for a long time. It has broad congressional support on the left and the right. It will be interesting to see if there is an infrastructure package, if this administration tries to help charter schools on the facilities finance front. So far they haven't, and so I'm not confident that they will, but members of Congress certainly have been on our side and understand the dilemma that we're in.
All right, so let's be less Potomac-centric, and let's get beyond the Beltway here and think about the states. Okay, so some have argued, maybe it was me or Checker, I can't remember, but that if you have a state where there's a strong Republican majority, even especially a supermajority, in some ways that can make life difficult on charter schools, because sometimes those Republicans are really not that interested in the quality side of charter schools. You know, and then you have places like Ohio, where we've had some significant problems in terms of quality and scandals, et cetera, that took a while to get addressed. They have finally been addressed. But that, you know, it's helpful to have a place like Colorado where you have these reform-minded Democrats who both support charter schools but also are good on accountability and care about equity. And so, I mean, do we see this? Are you at all worried about red states, kind of losing that part of the charter promise?
Say that again. What is the?
Well, no, just do you worry that in these strong Republican states, that sometimes the Republicans are not good when it comes to quality? They're not, they take the libertarian view that says we should never overrule parents. If parents want that school, if that school is full, even if its test scores are terrible, the parents have made a decision and they know best, and you technocrats, you bureaucrats, you Scott Pearson bureaucrats, you should just trust the parents.
So we played a role in passing the law in Kentucky in recent years. Kentucky, Mississippi, and Alabama are 3 states that we added to the map. They were all, these laws were enacted thanks largely to Republican legislatures and governors or governors who supported us. And all 3 laws are very much aligned with our model law, which has a heavy tilt in favor of accountability. So I don't have a lot of evidence in terms of red states being more loose on accountability. Certainly the late adopters haven't been. If anything, they want to make sure that they are enacting laws that create high quality schools. And so some on the right have argued that because they're approaching this in such a cautious way, that a lot of new schools are not opening. So I don't have a lot of evidence that Republicans are necessarily anti-accountability. I think within the think tank community, it's an interesting conversation that takes place over Twitter, but in practice, we haven't had a lot of recent examples.
Are you saying there's a disconnect between think tank people on Twitter and the real world, Nina? I hope no funders are listening. Okay.
So I think this is a good question. So first, 3 states Nina just mentioned, right, who just passed charter school laws: Kentucky, Alabama, and Mississippi. Those haven't been blue states since like LBJ was president. Okay, they're the late comers to this. I don't believe that Republicans always believe in competition. I think in some of those states, after DSEG, they set up private school systems, and that the lag down there is that they're afraid that public schools will compete with those private schools. I'm just saying, I'm just saying that, again, I wanted to challenge the premise of the panel that somehow Republicans have the advantage on charters, and I'm just noting that the 3 most recent states to pass charter laws are very red states. That's just my point. That's a fact I'm stating. The other thing I will say, though, is I do think quality matters. And I will tell you, I'm increasingly sympathetic to the idea of school choice and letting money move. I'm not a voucher supporter, but when I look at New York City, foisting an alternative pool teacher onto a school without that school or that parent having a choice about that teacher going to that school, and we all know which schools those ATR teachers are going to, right? They are not going to Park Slope, Brooklyn. They're not going to Stuyvesant. They're not going to any of those places. I don't have a good answer for that parent in terms of if they ask me, why shouldn't I be able to take my 15 or 20,000 with me and go somewhere else? I don't have a good answer. But I also so that's why I'm sympathetic to their argument that they should be able to take their money with them, because the system is screwing them and they don't have it out. But then I look at what happened in Detroit, where they created a bunch of schools. There was no oversight at all. Schools were opening and closing. The Credo data is not a valid way to evaluate how those schools performed. That data was collected after the big cap was lifted. It's totally invalid as a measure of what happened when things went crazy. So is the state data, because most of them weren't open long enough for them to collect a full year of data, or they didn't have enough kids to meet the end size. Even given that, we know they were crappy, and we know that because nobody controlled quality, while parents got to take some money with them and go somewhere else, they were running all over town trying to figure out what to do for their kid. Believe it or not, I've got 2 5-year-olds. I'm in this business. I've been in it for 30 years. It's hard for me to figure it out, okay? So I'm also sympathetic to the quality argument. I had my staff map it a couple years ago, the Credo data onto red and blue and purple states, and I can tell you the blue states have an advantage when you map the credo data onto whether a state is red or blue or purple. The purple states are in the middle, and the red, it's not that all the red states have bad credo data, and the credo data is getting a little dated at this point, but if you map it that way, the blue states have an advantage.
That's interesting. That's interesting. All right, so Nina's not convinced on this one, but yeah, no, it's a good debate. All right, one more political question, and then I do want to get the audience in here, in-house and on Twitter. One debate we've had over the years in the charter school world is whether or not we should make sure that middle class and upper middle class parents have access to charter schools also. That would broaden the tent politically. You would then have, these more affluent parents who perhaps have more political power. They end up writing donations to candidates, et cetera. That would make us a more powerful movement. And we have an experiment because there's some states where you have those kinds of schools, and there's other states where those schools are not allowed. As you look at the landscape right now, what are your thoughts on that? What are we learning about that? Any thoughts? I mean, look, Colorado and California are two states where we do have suburban charter schools. Has that been helpful, hurtful? Nina?
I'll go. Yeah, I mean, it definitely helpful. The early adopters certainly have a lot more schools in other regions other than inner cities. The later adopters have focused a lot more where the need is greatest and have limited the pool of people who can conceivably access high-quality public schools. But ultimately, though, it is very important for us to expand the base of support. As Carlos can attest, it is challenging, though. One of the schools I was talking to recently, Citizens of the World in California, their motto is based on creating schools in these suburbs, and the amount of opposition they get from the liberal white elite is actually quite astounding. And but at the end of the day, once the school is created and parents are sending their kids to these schools, it's very hard to then dial back the momentum around it. So it's going to be more challenging, but definitely something that our movement should pay more attention to.
Yeah, and I think we are always supportive of expanding our base of support, but I think that should largely be driven by need. In the suburbs, you might not have families who are looking necessarily for a bottom line based on a test score or anything related to matriculation, but they're really looking for a type of environment or a culture that the school creates for their child. And that I think we should embrace and welcome. What I don't like about the forced choice framing, though, that often comes into play when we talk about expanding the base to include suburban parents versus really sort of trying to make sure that we're driving the resources for growing charter schools in the inner cities, is because we frame it like it's somehow a zero-sum game. And it's also premised on the idea that we are totally resigned to mobilizing poor people behind the cause of charter schools and public school choice, behind voting regularly and actually voting with charter schools in mind, that it's just too hard a project to mobilize poor people, that we just simply need to expand into the suburbs because we know that those parents will absolutely vote and give candidates money. I just think that it is such a pessimistic point of view. And so I reject the framing of it, but I think that we should invite suburban families into the charter schools movement to the extent possible, and we need to do far more for rural families, particularly in California.
And I should point out, by the way,
and we still don't have the level of quality of public schools that we need in the Central Valley.
Put a plug in for a recent Fordham study called America's Charter School Deserts. And what you find out is that when we were just looking for places where there are low-income families in low-income census blocks without access to charter schools. And of course, there are a lot of those in the suburbs as poverty has moved out to the suburbs, especially the inner ring suburbs, and of course, in rural areas as well. Well, but I'm curious about this, Carlos. I mean, in California, you do have some middle-class, upper middle-class parents in charter schools. I mean, do you spend time trying to mobilize them? Are your messages, I feel like most of our messages nationally are around equity and they're around achievement gaps. And is that still the main script in California?
Well, I think the great thing about the charter movement is that your message, when you're trying to recruit students, is based on the charter. That
No, but I guess I mean about politics. When you're
Right.
trying to make a case in the assembly, are you still mostly talking about, hey, we got to talk about what's, this is good or bad for poor kids and kids of color?
Well, that is the message that dominates our conversations with Democrats, absolutely.
Yeah.
But for Republicans, I think we try to. I think there's a spectrum of views within the Republican Party about whether you should be completely laissez-faire or you should have some basic guardrails. If you're receiving public money, you should have some basic guardrails to protect particularly the most vulnerable students. There is a debate. But with Republicans in California, I think our arguments around accountability have been effective. The reality is, you can make the case to both Democrats and Republicans for charter schools in California. On the Democratic side, charter schools are the most progressive idea in the public education system. And we can argue that, and we do every day. But on the Republican side, charter schools represent the only liberty that you could possibly have within the traditional public school system, if you accept that you don't have the means to go to a private school. So we believe that both messages are consistent with our overall strategy, but we think that we've got arguments for both folks to be able to support charters in the legislature.
Okay. Charlie, anything on this? And if you've got a question, please start making your way over to the microphone, and we'll get you in here.
That sounds good. What I was going to say is I really think it depends on the suburb. You've got to do reconnaissance when you're going in to try to change schools. And in some places I think it's going to work, and in some places it's probably not. Where I live, suburban schools tend to be districts with very few schools, maybe 2 or 3 elementary schools, a middle school, and a high school. So it's very hard to drop into a suburban area and say you're going to open a new school, because then the issue of the movement of money becomes pretty, visible, and it's much harder to do. California obviously grew differently, faster, and with bigger municipalities, it's easier to do in suburban systems there. I guess the other point I would make is, so we'll go back to the history lesson here. Believe it or not, when Nina and I first met in the late 90s, there was no education advocacy infrastructure, right? 90% of the groups that are out there now doing this stuff didn't exist. Fordham was here. The Education Trust was here. And a couple of other groups. But there was, Nina and I, she worked for W in the White House. I worked for a congressman named George Miller, who was more supportive on what President Bush wanted to do on accountability than any other Democrat in Congress, and he was the lead on that. And we, this story isn't told, but we brought Ted Kennedy along, and so we worked together. But back then there was no advocacy infrastructure. Then, in the early aughts, we all know who, some very wealthy people were kind enough to start to put some philanthropic funding into these efforts that was on a different side, right? There was funding from people like Ford and Annenberg, but in the 90s, but it was directed at things that were mostly status quo. We'll leave it at that. The groups that came around in the aughts and the lead up to Obama, I feel like it was great to have the help, but a lot of what we did was, including us, it was kind of cookie cutter. There were about 5 things up until recently that people did. It was more charters, LIFO was big, Common Core, a couple other, key policy things, teacher evaluations with student data, and that was it. Everybody went out with that cookie cutter kit and they did their stuff, no matter what state or district they went to. That's what they did. And I think the next wave has to be different. We have to be nimble, and I think Colorado is a good lesson on this. They try a lot of different things. They can embed support for charters into a larger network of things they do that includes equity, that includes innovation. You can go to make a case to a suburban school district to do some of those things, without necessarily saying it has to be a charter, but the school could look very much like a charter. I mean, what charters have shown is you get people who can surround themselves around a mission and create their own pool of human capital and not have to draw from people who are trained through traditional routes. Really great things can happen that are really exciting. I'm surprised the unions didn't take that and run with that 20 years ago. They could be running all their own schools right now under that power structure. So that's what I think has to be different, is charters have to be part of a web of larger things, and they have so much that they can bring to this because, you know, they've got some really great success stories, and they're pretty much knocking it out of the park compared to most traditional public schools in the United States.
All right. So please ask your question. Make it a question, but do tell us who you are and the group you're from. Thanks.
I'm Michael Webb. I ran for school board over in Arlington, Virginia. School board, school choice, charter school candidate. Got about 20%. Not that wrong. But my question is that, okay, you're going to run into the problem in terms of Trump. All of these other traditional kind of things, and we started to make some headway with that. Well, one of the largest misperceptions in suburbia I found was that people see it as a poverty problem. We don't need that in a place that has great schools. However, what we're trying to do now, and I'm trying to get some input, is how do you sell this to people that are doing the education thing in terms of you can use this to address the achievement gap in your school. We can take those kids out that are underperforming and move them into these, lower.
I mean, one thing I can tell you about the polling I've been looking at that I can't really release the results of yet, but you'll see soon, is that's actually one of the weaker arguments when it comes to this stuff. We could go into the reasons. Connor's an expert on this. As soon as you bring, I'm telling you, a lot of the opposition to ed reform from white liberals is their kids are no longer the center of attention. Okay, that's what I'm going to tell you. I could document it here, but you don't have time. But that's a problem. So as soon as you bring that into it, a lot of them, it's not on the table. They may not even be aware of it, but in their mind, the money's starting to move, and the attention's moving away from their kids. Better arguments are schools need to innovate. Schools need to try new things. Schools need money, but not money without trying new ideas. They need money plus new ideas. That's what I'm seeing in our polling, and it's not a new finding necessarily. Obama ran on this, during both 08 and 2012. So those kinds of things seem to be better messages for all voters.
All right, so similar question on Twitter from Lindsay Hunsaker, who used to work with you on Capitol Hill, now at the Gates Foundation. And she says, in Washington, charter schools are facing yet another legal challenge. What are the best messages, outreach tools the pro-charter community can use to counter white liberal opposition in the state? So again, the message from the other side is charter schools are going to drain money from our traditional public schools. That worked well in Massachusetts. They're using it in Washington State, and the response should be what? That's not true, that we need innovation plus funding, that they're good for poor kids. What do we think? I mean, do we have a good response, Nina?
I don't know the specifics of what messages have worked in Washington State, but nationally the message that we need to keep repeating over and over and over is the fact that charter schools are public schools. It's amazing how few people still know that that's a fact. And just to talk about it a lot more from a branding standpoint, it shouldn't be something that is only confined to students in poor neighborhoods. And it could be that because we're close to Washington, D.C., and most of the charter schools in Washington, D.C. are catering to students in Wards 7 and 8, that a lot of people think of it as something that's serving the needs of those students. So we need to do a far better job of telling the story of charter schools and making sure that people know that they're public. This draining funding question is really about making sure people understand these are ultimately funds that are allocated for the education of students, not school systems. But we're doing quite a bit of polling and testing right now, so I don't have a definitive answer to that question.
I think I think white liberals are clearly the constituency that among the constituencies that's tough to persuade on the value of charter schools. But I do think there's something to what Charles was sharing earlier, which is, which I actually think is also something that we need to do more work on to determine in California whether or not it lands, particularly with decision makers, with elected officials. But this idea that charter schools are in fact a part of a broader ecosystem. And so if we are worried about the insolvency, the potential insolvency of our schools, we need to recognize that charter schools and the growth of charter schools is simply a red herring for bureaucrats who don't want to actually make the hard decisions to deal with the looming insolvency that will take not only charter schools down, but the entire system down if we don't actually act more decisively. Where's the money going, right? And I think for white liberals, maybe they don't care about where their money is going. But this idea that we're all in it together, and if we don't resolve the sort of fundamentals that are driving the insolvency, and by the way, chartering is a red herring, then we're all doomed for it, right? If we want to deflect and we want to focus our frustration on chartering and not realize that school districts are not right-sizing, we're not actually appreciating the reality that there's a lower birth rate and there are fewer students to serve, and yet school districts are only situated to grow. That's how they've always been structured, is to grow, never to never to downsize. And so, how do we talk about that in a soundbite? I don't know yet, and we think that we need to do more research in determining how to make that land. But I think that's the question: is how do we frame charter schools as a part of a broader ecosystem, where we're now partnering with our friends in school districts to figure out how to resolve these more tectonic problems, because we are not going to accept the premise that chartering is making the entire system insolvent. Let's be honest, right?
And Mike, just very quickly, I should have mentioned this sooner. The stories of our alumni are probably our greatest selling points. Nothing compares to that. So the more we can talk about the success of those students, why they went to a charter school and how their charter schools helped them, that there's nothing compared to it. I mean, you mentioned credo. I think for a very long time our movement has been relying too much on these very technocratic studies and comparisons between charter and public, which again win the debate in policy circles perhaps, but if you want to win hearts and minds, especially of voters, I think leading with the stories of the families and the impact of a good school on a community is really the way to go.
I mean, you see that, I should let this person answer the question, but my wife's family's from Camden, New Jersey. We go there to visit her family. She grew up there. You see that in Camden, just what the bringing in some great charter schools to the city has done for the neighborhoods, for the kids, for the families. And I'll tell you, they still have suspicions. My in-laws, they're not quite sure that they love the fact that the superintendent was installed by Chris Christie. And, they're a little suspicious that it's some of the wealthy individuals, in the South Jersey area that are playing Monopoly. And that's true to some extent. But it's really improved that community, and the hearts have embraced the charter schools there like you wouldn't believe. It's also partly due to a really great superintendent who just stepped down, who just was out there in the community every day showing that he was committed to every kid. And I guess that's the other thing I want to add before we get more questions about the Trump-DeVos thing. I think the parents and students who go to charter schools want to see that you're standing up against some of the agenda that they're pushing. They want to know that you're for them for other things, and that no matter where you are on those things, they're concerned about it. And it's part of the comments we made about signaling that you're part of a larger ecosystem. You're concerned about a child who has a constitutional right to an education regardless of their citizenship status to get an education, when you have a Secretary of Education that didn't seem to know that when she was in front of a Senate hearing. And it wasn't the first time she was at a hearing and she didn't know what she was talking about. So, she should have learned her lesson.
Okay, let's get very patient. Let's get the question in here.
Hi, I'm Peggy Thames, or Charles and also for the Hispanic outlook on higher ed. And this charter school thing starts to get complicated here in a place like Georgetown. Now, DC's known for having more charter schools per capita, I guess, than almost anywhere else, except in Georgetown. We only have one public school, which at this point is in construction, so the kids are being bused almost a half an hour away if everyone's having fit. And there's no swing school, no other possibilities, including a charter school. We are seeing a huge population now of families in Georgetown. They're millennials want to live in urban communities, and they're bringing their kids. It's great. We have so many kids now, but they're flooding the public schools. They don't have money for private schools.
Yeah.
So we have private schools, we have public schools, but there's a rising interest in maybe having a charter school, especially in the mid-school and high school ages, would offer, say, an IB or more, because our population is very international. It's very diverse, but it's not black-white diverse. It's, maybe
Right.
nationalities, languages, diplomats, all that.
All right, so the question?
How does that fit into this idea that charter schools are just for poor neighborhoods when, I see a burgeoning movement there.
Mm-hmm.
And I also like you to address
Okay.
the whole idea of the teacher unions out, because there seems to be some resistance about teaching for charter schools, and it seems to take on almost this private school idea where the unions aren't as strong. I'm not sure about that. That's what I'd like to know. So
Okay.
the unions
Yep.
and charter schools in highly diverse, wealthy areas.
So, yeah, I mean, should we embrace a charter school in Georgetown, even if it maybe is not going to be socioeconomically diverse, or does that hurt the movement in D.C. That's been able to talk so much about the good that it's doing for poor and kids of color?
Well, I like how Scott Pearson conveniently left before this question.
I know, what
Because he
happened?
has Scott Pearson, who's the head of the D.C. Public Charter School Board, is the person you should have asked that question of. I think the cost of real estate is probably one of the key reasons people haven't tried to open charter schools in Georgetown yet. There has been a concerted effort to create charter schools in communities that can attract students from all over the city. So when you go to Mundo Verde, Washington Latin, I went to see Yu Ying recently. These are schools that are attracting families from all walks of life, and we need more of them. So there is a way to do this while preserving the racial and ethnic and the socioeconomic diversity of the community. Basis High School is one example of a school which is in downtown DC, but also has been able to attract students from everywhere. So there is a way to do it, but you have to be intentional about putting the school in the right place and making sure that there's transportation dollars available and that the school has an outreach plan that is catering, because they're ultimately open enrollment schools, that they're catering to the entire needs of the community. I leave the union question to my two.
Two things. We'll do the easy one first. For Democrats, I think, and it's not quite fair, but it's a reality, they're sensitive to opening a charter that's going to be an all-white school, because someone will point to it as evidence of charters being a tool for segregation. So that argument's been made. I don't know why the AP wrote the story it did last year on this that was so biased, but they did it, and it's not the only story they've done like that. It's not fair, because the charter schools are no more segregated than the traditional schools that the kid would otherwise have been forced to go to if they didn't have the charter as a choice. We all know that. You have very smart people presenting data that compare individual schools and their demographics, the demographics of an entire city. And then you have other very smart people looking at that sort of apples to oranges comparison, saying, oh, you're right, yeah, the charters are more segregated. That's a problem. In some cases, charters have been used to segregate. We won't name names, but there are places where it has seemingly intentionally, but there are very few cases. That's the easy one. Look, with the unions, it's a business. They want more dues-paying members, and Al Shanker was for charter schools. He was the president of the AFT for a long time. through the 80s and into the 90s. He was a proponent of charter schools early on. Don't let anybody tell you that all he wanted were a couple of small laboratories where we would test out ideas. People say that, like smart people say that, but the documentation is he liked the idea of competition. He actually said he would be fine if every school were a charter. What he didn't anticipate is a lot of them would not be unionized. And so you're losing your market share. Every school that you don't have a dues-paying union member is a problem for you. And it's a pocketbook issue for the union itself. So that's a problem. That is why class size reduction is such a big issue. Are we out of time? I could shut up, but I didn't see anybody else with a question. That's why class size reduction is one of the big policies that unions push, and they don't emphasize quality. It's more dues-paying members. Same with pre-K. Yeah, pre-K is a great thing, but they're going to push to have as many pre-K teachers as possible and spend less per pupil, and they're not going to worry about quality. So,
Wait, Charlie, between that and the voucher comment, man, you sound like a Republican.
I want to make clear two things because I've been following the Twitter feed.
Yeah.
I'm not pro-voucher, but I am sympathetic to parents who say, give me my money and I want to run.
Yeah.
And for Chris Stewart, who's throwing me shade a little bit out there on Twitter, I didn't say test scores should be the only thing that we should use to judge schools, but I'm sympathetic to creating a bunch of schools, none of which are very high quality, and then making parents run around and find one. I don't think that's good public stewardship of dollars, but I agree there's a problem that there's a system that doesn't want to let you make choices, and so you've got to resolve those political and policy tensions, so it's complicated.
All right, so let's
I really
okay,
want
go
to
ahead.
try
Yes.
to answer the labor question, because I think it's something that we all struggle with, particularly when we're talking with Democrats. And when I was working for SEIU in California, one of the things that we heard from our members constantly when we would survey them as we prepared to go into contract negotiations was, they care. What do you care about most, right? And they cared a lot about benefits, but they cared a lot about having a voice at the workplace. And the reality is that the traditional public school system does not make a lot of room for teachers to raise their hand and say, hey, I think we're doing this wrong. Hey, I have an idea that we should test out. So if you care about teacher voice, you should care about charter public schools. If you care about teachers actually getting the professional development support that they need and maybe actually get evaluated and get some feedback, then you should care about charter public schools. So, I think that, again, we should not accept the premise of our friends on the Democratic side, and I'm a Democrat, to suggest that, oh gosh, like charter schools are inherently anti-labor. In California, that's not true. We have about 40% of the charter sector that's unionized, but it's when you're going to engage in collective bargaining as a charter operator with a union, what are the lines in the sand? Are you going to still be able to operate each of your schools in a nimble way that will allow you control over your schedule, for example, that will allow you to evaluate your teachers appropriately? There's some things that go into the secret sauce of chartering that have made our schools great that we need to preserve, but that doesn't mean that you can't do that with a union contract. Yeah. But let's compete. Let's have the debate about who actually represents teacher voices and who actually is providing teachers professional development and evaluation. That's the thing, is we shouldn't be running away from the debate, is what I'm saying, particularly as progressives.
All right, lightning round. Let me hear maybe just a minute from each of you on this question. Are things as tough for charter schools, especially on the left, as many of us feared 2 years ago? Or not? And second, how optimistic are you going forward, especially when it comes to policy, getting more funding for charter schools in the states, winning some of these battles? How are we feeling? Who wants to go first? Charlie?
There are challenges out there, and they really vary state to state. But I'm optimistic. Even Bill de Blasio, who didn't run as a charter champion, had to approve most of the charter applications that came in when he first was mayor. He gave a lot of them facilities, and the ones he didn't give facilities, Andrew Cuomo made him give the others facilities. So I'm optimistic. I think there are challenges out there. It's a weird political environment, so anything can happen. But I've been doing this for 30 years, and things have been pretty much on the same trajectory. And it may slow down from time to time, but I think we're moving to a system where continually people are going to want innovation and doing things differently. And education is just behind so many other fields. Unions, charters don't have to be inherently non-union. I think the unions blew it on this. That most other unions are okay with single-site contracts, for example. Most other unions have differential pay. They care about the training of their workers. They weight seniority, but it's not seniority uber alles. If they decided to get their act together tomorrow, we could have charters and unions being happy, and they're the only ones standing in their own way of there being a problem with this.
All right.
I'm not saying they'll do that, but I just wanted to make that clear before we ended.
Okay. Nina, how are we in better shape than we thought we were going to be 2 years ago, and how are you feeling going forward?
I'm actually quite optimistic. Last year, for instance, you've talked about this a little bit, is we had several victories on the fiscal equity front in states like Illinois, Colorado, Texas, Florida. So we have been able to add additional funds for facilities finance and charter schools. And in most of these places, the legislation passed with bipartisan support. So I am bullish and optimistic. We have seen a slowdown in growth. We're trying to find out why that's slowing down. Why are some authorizers not authorizing as many schools as before? Is it because we don't have enough people applying or something else? At the end of the day, though, fiscal equity, facilities access, talent pipeline, those are the three things we need to run effective schools. Mm-hmm. And they remain the challenges that we have to confront and pay attention to. In terms of just a positive note, our conference this year was in Texas. The commissioner of education, I don't know if you call him a commissioner or superintendent, is Mike Murat, and a huge advocate of charter schools. Basically, he wants people to come and open charter schools in Texas. This is a state that didn't start off on a sound footing when it came to quality, but because of recent changes in the state legislature, thanks to some of the Republicans who led the way on this issue, now you have a climate that is much better when it comes to quality. It has a fast track for high-quality operators to replicate. It has more funding for facilities finance. The state has also been closing its poor-performing schools. So when I look at a large state like that, I can't help but be optimistic, and we hope that come November and next year, California will actually be in a better place than we think it's going to be.
Okay.
Right?
All right. So, Carlos, last word about that. Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll cheat, and just one name comes to mind, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You have someone who just won a primary, Democratic primary against an entrenched Democrat in New York in the echelons of leadership within the Democratic Party. She's self-identifies as a socialist Democrat, and she supports charter schools, charter public schools. And I think it's because she experienced firsthand, and she got an elite education once she went to college, but she experienced as a girl how poorly the traditional public schools were in the Bronx. And so I think there is hope from sort of on the national landscape. Again, we shouldn't just accept these faulty premises that folks on the right and the left are putting out there for us to debate. I think we should antagonize them and antagonize the folks who are on the margins and interrogate their premises, because I think, look, she potentially become a national voice here. And in California specifically, I would say we are optimistic, but from, I would say, a measured perspective. We're rooted in reality here. We know that school districts are getting more creative and aggressive about how to root out charter schools in their own communities in California. And we also know that the likely next governor is not someone we supported. But I think that when we lead with our families, and we've done that for several years now, we've got an organizing program that develops leaders within the communities where our charter schools are operating. When we lead with our parents and we lead with their stories, and when they're mobilizing in large numbers, I think we can actually exceed people's expectations, even under the new political reality in California.
Okay, excellent. We'll let you have the last word. Please join me in thanking our fantastic panel. Very well done. I also want to thank Fordham's Nicholas Munyon Penny. Nicholas, there you are. Thank you for all the great work you did putting on this event, his first. Also, thanks to our hosts here at K&L Gates. Appreciate it. They were very kind to let us use their space. Our space is being renovated right now, and so we may be looking for more opportunities to be over here. And finally, stay tuned for a big announcement about a Fordham speaker series we're going to be doing with our partners at the Hoover Institution starting in September. It's going to go for the entire school year. I won't say too much about it yet, but we're calling it Education 2020, and it's going to be really cool. So look out for that. And if you are here in the live audience, we have beer and wine and cheese over there. Go get some. Those of you at home, go ahead and have a drink. It's after 5 o'clock. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.